The stainless steel carafe trembled faintly in her hand, though no one in the briefing room noticed. Ensign Liana Ward moved between rows of officers who barely glanced at her, faces buried in tablets, uniforms heavy with ribbons and authority. She served their coffee the way she had for months, invisible in a room where power sat in chairs, and she remained standing. Yet beneath the quiet routine, her pulse hammered a warning she couldn't explain. Something in the air felt charged, as if the walls themselves sensed a shift coming. The tension arrived in a single moment, sharp, humiliating, unforgettable. A commander cleared his throat without lifting his eyes. "Careful with that, sweetheart. Wouldn't want you spilling it on someone important." Liana froze mid-pour. The word sweetheart landed like a slap, soft enough to sound harmless, heavy enough to remind her exactly where they believed she belonged. A few officers smirked. One whispered something behind a hand, triggering a ripple of amusement that spread like a stain. The laugh they tried to hide felt louder than any outburst. No one asked why an ensign was serving coffee. No one cared that she shouldn't be doing it at all. She kept her expression neutral, though heat crawled up her neck and burned behind her eyes. She breathed through it. She had endured worse. She had endured silence, whispers, and the unspoken question of why a woman with an aviation background would be stationed here instead of the sky she belonged in. She had endured being overlooked, sidelined, conveniently forgotten whenever she raised her hand for assignments that mysteriously dissolved once her name appeared. But today felt different. Today felt dangerous. A new voice entered the room, a deeper silence following it rather than preceding it. Boots struck the tile in a controlled rhythm, the sound crisp enough to cut through conversations. The door had opened without a warning, and the officers turned instinctively, shoulders straightening, hands smoothing uniforms. The shift from arrogance to discipline happened like a tide retreating. Admiral Rourke stepped inside. His presence filled the room before his voice did, broad, shouldered, calm, with the restrained authority of a man who carried entire fleets on his decisions. His eyes swept the space with an expression that didn't need sharpness. Quiet scrutiny alone made people shrink. Liana lowered her gaze, forcing herself into the role they expected, silent, compliant, invisible. But she felt his attention touch her for a fraction of a second. It was not pity. It was recognition in a way that threatened to unravel the wall she'd built inside herself. The Admiral moved toward the head of the table. Conversations died completely now. Even the officers who'd been smirking at her moments before straightened as if bracing for judgment. He set his folder down, but instead of beginning the briefing, he let the silence linger, heavy, intentional. Eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought. Then he said it, her call sign, Ghost Hawk. The room froze in a way she had never seen. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Liana's breath caught. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in months, not since the mission that ended her flight career, or so they believed. The name carried smoke, fire, and the memory of a sky she had once owned, and hearing it now felt like someone pulling open a sealed wound in front of an audience. Several officers turned to her with open confusion. Some stared as though they'd misheard. One lieutenant muttered a shocked curse under his breath. The commander, who had called her sweetheart earlier, blinked rapidly, his smirk collapsing. The Admiral's expression didn't change. He simply watched her, letting the weight of the name settle over the room like dust on a battlefield. Liana felt a tightness in her throat, a storm of humiliation, pride, fear, and disbelief colliding at once. The coffee carafe shook so visibly that she had to steady it with both hands. She wished she could vanish. She wished she could fly again. She wished the truth wasn't about to tear open in front of all these people. Admiral Rourke finally looked away, but the silence he left behind wrapped itself around her like chains. No one in that room had expected the Admiral to know her name. But none of them were prepared for what he would reveal next. The silence that followed her call sign didn't fade. It deepened, thickened, tightened like a noose around every throat in the room. Ileana felt as if her lungs were filling with cold water. The carafe in her hands suddenly seemed heavier, as though the Admiral's single word had shifted the gravity in the entire briefing room. Admiral Rourke opened the folder before him but didn't look down. His gaze rested on the officers crowding the table. "Interesting," he said quietly, almost contemplatively. "Not one of you informed me that we had a decorated combat pilot serving coffee this morning." Murmurs erupted. Quick, nervous. A few officers exchanged glances as if trying to verify whether the Admiral was speaking metaphorically, sarcastically, or if they'd just been caught in an ignorance so profound it would haunt their evaluation reports. Liana wished he hadn't said it, not like this, not in front of them. The truth was a wound she still tried to keep stitched shut. Her chest tightened as she placed the carafe on the counter, her back turned so they wouldn't see the war happening in her eyes. She could still feel their stares clawing into her. A captain cleared his throat, attempting to recover the authority he no longer felt. "Sir, we weren't informed of her, previous status." The Admiral didn't glance up. "You weren't informed because you never bothered to ask who she was." The reprimand wasn't loud, but it landed harder than a shouted accusation. Liana saw shoulders draw inward. Officers who moments ago had laughed at her, now shrinking under a truth they couldn't deflect. Admiral Rourke finally lifted his eyes, and they pinned the commander who'd called her sweetheart. "I heard the remark you made." A tremor passed through the man's jaw. He looked as though he wished the room would collapse and bury him along with his mistake. But the Admiral didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Addressing a naval aviator, one who risked her life to protect a squadron you have never had the privilege of flying with, in such a manner is beneath the uniform you wear. Every word was measured, deliberate, cutting without cruelty. It was not anger that made the room tremble. It was disappointment, the kind that seeped into skin and bone. Liana stood with her hands clasped behind her back now, trying to steady her breathing. Recognition felt like a spotlight she had never wanted. She didn't crave admiration, only the chance to serve again. But she had been grounded, shelved, moved from office to office like a piece of equipment no one knew how to use anymore. Ghost Hawk, the name echoed inside her chest like a memory refusing to die. It had been her identity once, a whisper in the cockpit, a symbol of precision, a reputation earned through storms of fire. A name carved from the night she saved an entire wing during a blackout mission that still lived only in classified reports. That night had cost her everything. Her plane had lost half its systems. Her landing had been called impossible. She'd brought her crew home, bleeding and alive, but the crash that followed had taken her future in the sky. At least that was what the doctors believed, what the board believed, what she had been forced to accept. But not the Admiral. Rourke closed the folder and folded his hands. "Ghost Hawk is not here to pour your coffee," he said. "She is here because I requested her by name." Every heart in the room seemed to stop. Even Liana felt her own pulse stutter. Requested her by name. Her hands trembled again, but this time from something entirely different, something dangerously close to hope. The Admiral continued, his tone calm, firm. "There is an operation underway, one that requires someone with her experience, her instincts, and her capacity to go unnoticed when necessary." A few officers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some straightened, sensing the gravity of what was being discussed. The air rippled with the realization that they had overlooked someone the Admiral viewed as essential. But Liana barely heard them. Her entire world narrowed to the quiet certainty in Rourke's voice. She didn't understand. She hadn't been cleared, hadn't been briefed, hadn't even been allowed near an aircraft since the board had grounded her indefinitely. Why now? Why her? And why did he sound as though he trusted her more than anyone else in the room? As the questions crowded her mind, the Admiral's gaze met hers again. Not as a superior evaluating a subordinate, not as an officer looking at someone they needed to reprimand or reassign, but as a commander who had already decided she was capable of far more than anyone in the room realized. And in that moment, Leona understood something terrifying. The Admiral knew a secret she had kept buried even from herself. A secret that was about to pull her back into the sky she thought she'd lost forever. The briefing room felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn inward in anticipation of whatever truth Admiral Rourke was about to uncover. Officers who had barely acknowledged Leona minutes earlier now watched her with a strange mix of unease and curiosity, like they were witnessing someone step out of a shadow they hadn't known was cast by their own neglect. Leona stood still, every muscle coiled, uncertain whether she wanted to hear what came next or run from it. Admiral Rourke rested his hands on the edge of the table, the room holding its breath. 6 months ago, he began. An encrypted distress signal was intercepted over the strait. A crashed reconnaissance drone presumed lost, but the final telemetry showed something unusual. An attempted recovery maneuver performed manually. The officers shifted, confused. Drones didn't allow manual overrides from the outside. Unless Rourke continued, his gaze directed at the screen behind them, though he hadn't turned it on. The override signature matched one pilot in our entire records, one pilot whose neural adaptive instinct scores had once been classified as anomalous, and then his eyes returned to her. Ghost Hawk. Leona felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had expected a reprimand, an assignment, maybe a reluctant acknowledgement of her past, but not this. Not the memory she had locked away so deeply she'd convinced herself it had never happened. The commander who had mocked her earlier swallowed hard. Sir, with respect, she hasn't flown since the crash. Her wings are suspended. Rourke didn't even glance at him. Suspended, he repeated softly, not revoked. Leona's heartbeat stuttered. She remembered the night of the crash more vividly than she allowed herself to admit. The sparks, the fire, the way the world had spun and twisted. The moment she believed she was already a ghost, drifting above her own body. But she also remembered something else, something she had never put into words. I ran diagnostics after your accident, the Admiral said, his voice low. The neural interface logs were inconsistent with a pilot losing control. They showed precision, clarity, decisions executed faster than any human reflex. A ripple of shock moved through the room. The Admiral's tone softened, just barely. You didn't crash because you failed, Ensign. You crashed because your aircraft was sabotaged. The air left her lungs in a single, violent breath. Sabotaged? The word hit her like a blow. Her fingers curled against her side. Someone in the room muttered a quiet oath, but most remained silent, stunned. Rourke watched her carefully. You were never meant to survive that night, but you did, and the men responsible have resurfaced. Her vision blurred for a moment, not with tears, but with the rush of too many truths colliding at once. All those months of being shuffled, ignored, relegated to tasks far below her rank. It had felt like punishment. She'd never asked for sympathy, but she had accepted the quiet exile as the Navy's way of setting her aside. But it hadn't been that. It had been protection, the operation we're preparing. Rourke continued. Targets a covert syndicate specializing in hijacking experimental military tech, the same group that accessed your aircraft mid-flight. He paused, letting the information sink in, letting the officers swallow the reality that the woman they dismissed had been at the center of something far larger than any of them. You're the only one who's seen their tactics up close, and the only one who can anticipate their next move. Leona felt something inside her shift, something sharp and long, buried rising like a blade from the ashes. Anger, justice, a need for truth she had never allowed herself to confront. But it wasn't pride that straightened her spine. It was responsibility. Her voice, when it finally emerged, felt foreign even to her. Sir, why didn't anyone tell me you were recovering? He said quietly. Physically, and more importantly, psychologically. They wanted you unstable, haunted, doubting your own instincts. I refused to give them that victory." The officers stared at him in disbelief. Admirals didn't explain themselves. But Rourke wasn't shielding his ego, he was acknowledging a fact he had carried alone, because no one else had cared enough to look deeper. "And now?" she whispered. His answer was simple: "Now we fight back." The room seemed to inhale at his words. The briefing they had expected was gone, replaced by the realization that they were witnessing the beginning of a mission rooted in betrayal, survival, and unfinished war. But before anyone else could speak, the Admiral added something that silenced even their thoughts. "You're reinstated, Ghost Hawk, effective immediately." Shock splintered through her. Fear, relief, disbelief, and a fierce surge of purpose all crashing together. Her wings, her identity, the sky she had been forced to abandon, they were being returned to her, not as a gift, but as a responsibility she had earned long before anyone in this room knew her name. And the moment he said it, she felt the world shift again. She was no longer the woman serving coffee. She was the storm coming for the ones who believed she had died in the wreck they created. The words, "You're reinstated," echoed inside her like a forgotten heartbeat suddenly revived. Liana stood motionless. The world, tilting toward a future she'd forced herself to stop dreaming about. For months, she had walked these corridors as a ghost of who she had once been. Now the Admiral had spoken her call sign aloud, and something long, buried, cracked open inside her, sharp and bright. The officers around her shifted, some in disbelief, others in quiet awe. Their silence held the weight of unspoken apologies, though none dared to voice them. Not yet. Respect reclaimed too late came with its own quiet shame. Admiral Rourke's posture remained steady, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air, as if he had been waiting for this moment a long time. For her to stand again, for the truth to be acknowledged, not hidden beneath medical reports and bureaucratic sentences. "You will be briefed privately," he said, turning a page in the file, though everyone knew he was no longer reading it. "There are details this room isn't cleared for." His eyes flicked to the officers, reminding them of the invisible line separating their assumptions from the classified reality beneath it. Liana felt dozens of eyes on her, and for the first time she did not shrink beneath them. Something within her had aligned resolve, memory, purpose. The name Ghost Hawk no longer felt like a ghost she couldn't outrun. It felt like truth reclaiming its rightful space. Rourke continued, "Your recovery wasn't a coincidence. I've monitored every stage personally, not because I doubted your courage, but because I expected they would strike again." A chill threaded its way down her spine. "You think they're already moving," she said, more statement than question. The memory of the sabotage flickered behind her eyelids, systems glitching, alarms screaming, metal burning. A night she had survived by instinct alone. The Admiral nodded once. "They have something new, something we can't allow to reach the wrong hands." His voice darkened. "And they want you silenced before you connect the missing pieces." A ripple of shock moved through the room, but Liana's thoughts had already leapt ahead. Images surfaced, encrypted logs she'd never been allowed to review, fragments of memory she'd dismissed as trauma fallout, moments in the crash where the aircraft had felt almost guided. Not by her, not by any system she recognized. "Why me?" she asked quietly, though she already sensed part of the answer. Rourke regarded her with a depth that unsettled the room. "Because you survived something you weren't meant to, because your instincts operate at a level we still don't fully understand, and because they fear what you remember." Liana inhaled slowly. Fear wasn't new. She had lived with it in the dark hours of the night, in the ache of her healing body, in the emptiness left by the sky she once commanded. But this was different. This fear didn't shrink her, it sharpened her. "Ghost Hawk," the Admiral said, his voice lowering, "you're not here by accident. You were brought to this base under the guise of administrative reassignment to keep you close, protected, and off their radar." The window for secrecy has closed. The commander who had mocked her earlier finally found his courage to speak. Sir, if she's being targeted, isn't reinserting her into active operations extremely dangerous? Rourke looked at him with a calm that stole the breath from the room. She was born in danger, trained in it, shaped by it. The question isn't whether she can handle risk. His gaze returned to Lyanna, unwavering. It's whether the rest of you can keep up. Silence followed, heavy and unfiltered. No one dared respond. The Admiral stepped away from the table. Ensign Ward, you will report to Hangar 6 in 1 hour. Your briefing begins there. Hangar 6. A place she hadn't entered since before the crash. Her throat tightened at the memory of polished floors, fuel-scented air, maintenance crews working under bright lights, the silhouettes of aircraft that once felt like extensions of her own. Heartbeat, but the Admiral wasn't finished. You won't be flying one of our standard birds. He closed the folder slowly, deliberately. Your new craft is classified beyond the scope of this room. Adaptive Reese, Bond's architecture, experimental, but built for pilots with neural instinct patterns like yours. A murmur swept through the officers like electricity. Lyanna's pulse quickened. She hadn't touched a cockpit in months, yet something deep inside her, dormant but not dead, stirred awake. The sky was calling her back, not as a homecoming, but as a battlefield. The Admiral stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could truly absorb the weight of it. This mission will test you. It will test everything they try to bury. But you're not returning to the sky as a victim. You're returning as the weapon they feared. Her breath shook, but she didn't look away. The room, the officers, the shame, the coffee they'd made her serve. It all fell away against the clarity rising inside her. Ghost Hawk had not died in the fire. She had survived it, and now she was being unleashed. Rourke gave a final nod. 1 hour, dismissed. The officers rose as the Admiral exited, but Lyanna remained still a moment longer. She felt the weight of their stares, but no longer carried their judgment. The humiliation that once clung to her had burned away in a single truth. She was not defined by the role they forced upon her. She was defined by the fight she was about to reclaim. As she finally turned to leave, her reflection in the polished glass panel of the briefing room caught her eye. For months she'd seen only emptiness there, a woman grounded, reduced, diminished. But now she saw something different. A shadow sharpened into a silhouette, a pilot reborn, a storm returning to the sky. Ghost Hawk walked out of the room, not as the woman who had served coffee, but as the force they would soon regret underestimating.